When you hear the word church, do you tense up? Some of you don't doubt God. You doubt the people who represented Him. If you say your church wounded, here's the real question. What actually happened? Not the label, not the emotion. What occurred? Because abuse, betrayal, legalism, and disappointment are not the same thing. And if we misdiagnose the wound, we won't find the cure. Let's define it before we try to heal it.
Some of you describe yourselves as church wounded. That phrase carries weight. It is not trendy language. It is not dramatic exaggeration. It represents something real. If you have been hurt inside a church, the pain can cut deeper than other kinds of wounds because it happened in a place that claimed to represent God. That matters. When harm happens in a social club, it disappoints. When harm happens in a workplace, it frustrates. When harm happens in a church, it destabilizes faith. Because church is not just an organization. It carries spiritual authority. It claims to speak about ultimate truth. It sings about love. It prays about grace. So when injury happens there, it feels like something sacred has been violated. So let's investigate this carefully. Do you consider yourself church wounded? Before healing can happen, we must identify the injury. Not just what you felt, not just how it shaped you, not just how often you replay it in your mind. What actually occurred? If we cannot define the injury, we cannot prescribe the cure. The New Testament never pretends church life is flawless. In 1 Corinthians 3 verse 3, Paul says, "For you are still of the flesh. For while there is jealousy and strife among you," that's church. In Galatians 5 verse 15, "If you bite and devour one another, watch out that you are not consumed by one another." That's church. In Acts of the Apostles 6 verse 1, a complaint arises because widows were being neglected in the daily distribution. That's church. Conflict, jealousy, neglect, and strife. Scripture records it plainly. So if you experience conflict, failure, or even sin in church, Scripture does not deny that possibility. It anticipates it. But not every wound is the same, and if we do not distinguish categories, everything becomes trauma, and nothing becomes clear. Clarity is not cold. Clarity is mercy. There are 4 primary categories of church wounds. We need structure. Otherwise, the word wounded becomes elastic and loses meaning. First category is abuse. This is the most serious category. Spiritual coercion, manipulation using God's authority, covering up wrongdoing, financial exploitation, intimate misconduct, threatening someone spiritually to maintain control, silencing victims to protect reputation. This is not mere conflict. This is power misused, and Scripture condemns abusive leadership in severe language. In Ezekiel 34, God rebukes shepherds who feed themselves instead of the flock. They strengthen not the weak. They bind not the injured. They rule with force and harshness. That is not subtle. In Matthew 23, Jesus publicly denounces religious hypocrisy. He calls out leaders who load people with burdens, but will not lift a finger to help. In Luke 17 verses 1 to 2, he says it would be better for someone to have a millstone tied around their neck and be thrown into the sea than to cause others to stumble. Jesus is not soft toward spiritual abuse. If your wound falls here, safety comes first. Endurance is not holiness if the environment is abusive. Remaining in ongoing harm is not spiritual maturity. Leaving may not be rebellion. It may be obedience. Abuse requires protection, counsel, sometimes legal intervention. It requires external accountability. It requires light. Do not minimize abuse, but do not mislabel everything as abuse either. The category is too serious for inflation. Second is betrayal or moral failure. A pastor falls morally. A leader lies. A trusted friend gossips. Money is mishandled. An elder covers up something shameful. This devastates because trust was involved. You believed in them. You respected them. You perhaps patterned your life around their teaching. When that collapses, it feels like the ground gives way. Consider Galatians 2 verses 11 to 14, where Paul confronts Peter publicly for hypocrisy. Even apostles failed under pressure. Or 2 Samuel verse 12, where Nathan confronts King David after grievous sin. Leadership failure is not new. The Bible does not airbrush its heroes. But here is the crucial distinction. God's character is not invalidated by a leader's collapse. A leader misrepresenting God does not redefine who God is. If your faith was built primarily on personality instead of Christ, that collapse will shake everything. Healing here requires separating Christ from the person who misrepresented him. That separation can take time, but it is essential. Third is institutional legalism or cultural rigidity. Sometimes the wound is not scandal. It is suffocation. Rules elevated above mercy. Appearance elevated above heart. Cultural preferences elevated above Scripture. Performance treated as proof of spirituality. You were exhausted trying to measure up. You felt constantly observed. You learned to perform rather than confess. In Mark 7 verse 8, Jesus says, "You leave the commandment of God and hold to the tradition of men." In Colossians 2 verse 23, Paul speaks of regulations that have an appearance of wisdom in promoting self-made religion, but are of no value in stopping the indulgence of the flesh. Performance religion looks strict, and it often lacks power. If you are crushed under legalism, the solution is not abandoning Christ. It is rediscovering grace. Legalism wounds by confusing compliance with transformation. The gospel heals by grounding obedience in love, not fear. Fourth is disappointment or misplaced expectation. This is the most common category and the hardest to hear because sometimes the church did not meet expectations. They didn't rally around you the way you hoped. They didn't recognize your gift. They didn't agree with your interpretation. They didn't elevate your concern to urgency. They didn't align with your political or cultural emphasis. That hurts, but hurt is not automatically abuse. The church is described in 1 Corinthians 12 verses 12 to 27 as a body with many parts. No single part receives all attention. No single part directs the whole. In Ephesians 4 verses 15 to 16, growth happens when each part is working properly. The church is not designed to function as a customized emotional ecosystem for one individual. It is a gathered people pursuing Christ together, imperfectly. If this is the wound, healing may require recalibration of expectation, not lowering standards for sin, but adjusting expectations for humanity. Some diagnostic questions. Clarity requires courage. Was there identifiable sin? What specifically? Was it unrepentant or addressed? Was it systemic or personal? Did you attempt Matthew 18? Matthew 18 verses 15 to 17. Are you wounded because of injustice? Or because your preferences were denied? Have you equated disagreement with persecution? These are uncomfortable, but vagueness feeds bitterness. Bitterness grows in undefined narratives. It is precision that feeds healing. Christ is not the worst Christian you've met. In Hebrews 4 verse 15, we are told we have a high priest who sympathizes with weakness. In Psalm 34 verse 18, the Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit. If someone harmed you in his name, that wound is deep, but do not let your offender become your theologian. Their failure does not rewrite the gospel. Their sin does not redefine Christ. Community remains the pattern. In Hebrews 10 verses 24 to 25, believers are instructed not to neglect meeting together. In James 5 verse 16, confession and prayer are tied to healing. Isolation can feel safe. It removes risk. It also removes sharpening, encouragement, correction, growth. Isolation protects wounds. It rarely heals them. Re-engagement should be wise, slow, discerning. But permanent withdrawal is not the biblical vision. What are the high-level healing steps? Write down what happened in factual language. Remove exaggeration. Seek counsel outside the environment that harmed you. Distinguish grief from rage. Grief. mourns. Rage seeks to punish. Refuse to build permanent doctrine from temporary trauma. Visit a different faith community without immediate commitment. Observe quietly. Look for humility in leadership, not charisma. Evaluate fruit over time, Matthew 7 verse 16. Healing is incremental. It is rarely dramatic. It often feels slower than you want, but it is possible. Some churches are unsafe. Leave them. Some churches are immature. Grow with them or move on. Most churches are imperfect. Christ has never abused anyone, but Christians sometimes have. If your wound is real, God sees it. If your bitterness is growing unchecked, He sees that too. Clarity is mercy, and healing begins when we tell the truth about what brought us to believe we are church wounded.
If you like this content, then kindly hit like, subscribe, and share.